Tonight on Primetime Politics, the government's position on Iran.
All they are doing is trying to pander in all directions while dividing our country and confusing our allies.
The opposition will get their chance to ask questions about the conflict now engulfing the Middle East as the government agrees to a take-note debate on the fighting. Coming up, former Minister for Foreign Affairs Lloyd Axworthy, we will speak to him about the Prime Minister's shifting statements about the fighting. Also, parliamentary journalists Stephanie Taylor and Stephen Chase both traveled with Mark Carney to Asia last week, and they'll share how the fighting in Iran threw the Prime Minister's agenda off course. Plus,
we will be investing over $900 million in defense-related research.
More money for defense industries. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Well, we begin this evening with Iran as the fighting in that country dominated Parliament's return today, with government and opposition parties agreeing to hold a take-note debate tonight. Now, this debate will allow members of Parliament to talk about the hostilities in Iran and the Middle East, also the impact those hostilities are having on Canadians who live in the affected region. And going in, we know opposition members have plenty of questions about the government's position on the conflict, particularly questions about the Prime Minister and where he stands on the fighting.
The Prime Minister has taken 4 different positions on the war in the Middle East in 4 days. He was for the attack. Then he said he regretted his support for the attack. Then he said his support for the attack was illegal. Then he said he was open to contributing Canadian troops to the war. And then he said his party has said one thing to one group and another thing to other groups. All they are doing is trying to pander in all directions while dividing our country and confusing our allies.
We've just heard from the Prime Minister's office that at least at this point, he does not intend to participate in the debate tonight. That is unacceptable. After changing positions by our count 4 times, Canadians deserve to have a clear statement from the Prime Minister in this House to be accountable not only to parliamentarians, but to the Canadian public.
Well, to talk about the issue, we are happy to have in studio with us right now Lloyd Axworthy, former Minister for Foreign Affairs in the Chrétien government. Mr. Axworthy, good to see you again. Thank you for the time.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
So the Prime Minister will not be attending this take-note debate in the House of Commons this evening. I'm wondering what your reaction to that is. Does that take away any of the impact, the potential to get clarity on a number of questions right now?
I agree with that. I mean, I think having a debate was a very good step, and I give credit to some of the Liberal MPs who sort of pushed for an accounting. The fact that the Prime Minister wouldn't be there for it, I'm not sure his reasoning, and I'm sure it's good reasons of state, but nevertheless, this is an important moment for Canadians to find out what's going on. And I think in particular, as you know, the Prime Minister had a conversation with Donald Trump apparently on Sunday. What were they talking about? Were we talking about further commitments? What was the nature of the conversation? I think this is an opportunity to not only to lay it out, but to hear back.
Well, so much of the attention has been on the Prime Minister's shifting response to the conflict and what's taking place right now in the Middle East. Would your questions be about the shifting response from the PM, or would it be specifically about that weekend phone call with Donald Trump?
I think that's, Michael, that's just part of a pattern, I think. I am concerned that step by step we seem to be moving towards more of a direct involvement. The Prime Minister said hypothetically we could be helping out on the Gulf. The Chief of the Defense Staff has sent people there to negotiate with them. And what concerns me about that is that running parallel to that track is the fact that we've got literally tens of thousands of Canadians in a war zone that's going to get, I think, more risky, more difficult. And we should be really using those resources first to determine the safety for the Canadians.
Okay, to get Canadians stuck in the zone, out of the danger zone, back to safety, as you say. Although, to your point about the potential for a widening conflict in Canada's involvement, we did hear from David McGuinty, the Defence Minister, today. Let's play a bit of what we heard from Mr. McGuinty. This was this afternoon.
It's important for Canadians to know that Canada was not consulted before the action undertaken by Israel and the United States. Canada was not asked to comment. Canada has not participated, and Canada will not be participating.
Okay, so underlining the last words there, that Canada would not be participating. Does that address any of your concerns about this country being?
Well, I was very careful on his words that he was saying, we're not participating in the so-called Epic Fury campaign, but are we going to put people on the ground to provide defensive measures for UAE or for Qatar? Those are real questions. At the same time, as I say, we're really lacking resources to get people out and evacuated, and also because this war is really, the old saying about you unleash the dogs of war, you're not sure where they're going to go. I think this has caught people by surprise. I think Trump was assuming that he could do another Venezuela. He could sort of decapitate a leader, and then you've solved the problem. Iran is not Venezuela, and there's clearly an ongoing commitment, defiance, if you like, by the Iranians. So this is an ongoing, and could be really not just a messy as it is now, dangerous one, but it could involve a lot of potentially even civil wars inside Iran with all the different kinds of groups warring with each other. We don't want Canadians sitting in the basements while that's happening.
Okay, but build on that though, because what is, to my understanding, what has been considered thus far was, as you said, putting Canadian troops to, and there's no commitment on this, but they're exploring, could Canadian troops shore up our allies? What's wrong with a defensive stance, not an offensive stance, striking Iran directly, but what's wrong with defending a UAE or a Bahrain?
Well, to begin with, they're not allies. They're partners. We export weapons to them, and we try to get money back. But we have no treaty. We have no alliance. It's not like NATO or NORAD. So you can say they're partners, but is it our job at this point in time to running to their defense? That's part of having a debate. I think Canadians generally are showing a lot of reluctance to get into it, and I think I share that in one real sense. First, I think there's a much more immediate responsibility, which is to really plan an evacuation if situations get worse, or even now. I mean, we have over 3,000 sort of dual citizens in Iran, but we have no embassy, we have no consulate. There's no way for them to get out. To me, I hope this comes in the debate, this should be the priority. And I think if you want to provide some defensing, but Michael, here's another thing that concerns me. Donald Trump has an appetite for glomming on to any little sort of endorsement and exploding it and ballooning it. If we say we're going, he's going to, maybe Mr. Carney have already had that conversation, but he's going to try to build on that. And there's the old slippery slope idea. Once you're there, what are you going to do next for me?
Mm-hmm. Well, which brings me back to the initial support that we heard from the Prime Minister. And to be fair, he has amended that support, saying it came with a regret. But he on the Saturday morning, when people were waking up a week ago of Saturday, he said he supported the strike. What do you think happened there? Do you see that as a failure of global affairs to advise properly? Do you see that as the Prime Minister, freelancing his own opinion on this?
I think there's a black box there somewhere. I don't think anybody's fessing up. My own sense is that he has a certain agenda, which is to try to walk a tight line between keeping Mr. Trump reasonably happy, but at the same time living up to what we consider to be Canadian standards and norms. And I think he, in this case, sort of went to one side of that equation, and all of a sudden he realized that was putting him in a real box, and he had to come to the other side. I'm still not sure or clarified exactly where we are as a government, and that's why I hope the debate tonight would clarify that, and I think even help shape that, because that's what Parliament is for. But if the Prime Minister's not there, it takes something away from that.
You know, as we have this discussion, I do want to state what has been observed, though, of the Iranian regime. They're responsible for the deaths and the persecution of tens of thousands. They have spread, as a regime, have spread insecurity, destabilized neighboring countries, funding groups like Hezbollah. Is it understandable that there is support for what the United States did to the Iranian regime?
They don't have much support in their own population. I mean, and I think people are saying there's no question that it was a repressive organization. Nobody has any time of day for what they were doing. In fact, a lot of people, but I think we didn't pay a lot of attention to Iran in this country. We don't know much about it. And I think what we should have been looking at, what are the other ways that could be supportive? I mean, I think, you know, Donald Trump launched this attack in the midst of a negotiation on putting a restriction on nuclear weapons. He says we're there to stop nuclear weapons. Well, you had a diplomatic forum to do that. And at the same time, remember, he's the guy that tore up the standing multilateral agreement that was done in 2015. So, you know, there's such a mixed message coming out of Washington. And that's why I guess I would make a point that we shouldn't be making too many commitments until we have a much clearer sense of what are the end game and what is going on here, and assess it from our point of view, especially because I think one of the objectives we should have as Canadians is to disentangle ourselves from too much involvement or engagement with the U.S. military. We're going to have to be a little bit more independent when it comes to dealing with Mr. Trump in the Arctic and our border issues. And I think this is why we want to make sure we don't make hostage to ourselves.
Well, you talk about opinions, and you did write a week ago an op-ed piece that was published in the Toronto Star. And in it, you noted that Canada essentially is a country that relies on law more than actual force to ensure its security. So to borrow a word that you used in that same op-ed piece, was it reckless for the Prime Minister to support the strikes?
Yes, I think it was, the timing was not right. I mean, I don't think there was any sort of immediacy. I mean, I think a Prime Minister of Canada has a responsibility to Parliament, to be accountable, and to find out what Canadians think, and not to make unilateral decisions about, in this case, a unilateral aggression by Trump and by Mr. Netanyahu.
Is there a way the Prime Minister can walk back those statements? I know he's tried to amend it. Is there a way for him to be able to walk it back without offending the Americans, while acknowledging in some ways, you know, the international law?
Well, I think there's going to be lots of opportunity. This is a war that is going to require a lot of engagement, not necessarily on the end of a gun or an airplane. Refugees are going to be pouring out, displaced people, rebuilding. I mean, there's a whole series of things that if you really want to help the Iranians establish something, then I think that's where Canada can play a very important role, and that's why we shouldn't compromise ourselves.
Okay. Lloyd Axworthy, always appreciate the time. Thank you for coming by this evening.
It was nice to be here. Thank you, Michael.
And that's Lloyd Axworthy, former Minister for Foreign Affairs in the Chrétien government, a time he's written about in his book, My Life in Politics, a worthwhile read from Lloyd Axworthy. Well, the start of the conflict in Iran did coincide with the Prime Minister's visit to India, Australia, and Japan. And to talk about this, we're now joined by two journalists who were traveling with the Prime Minister last week. Stephen Chase, to the right of your screen, is a senior parliamentary reporter for the Globe and Mail. And in studio with me is Stephanie Taylor, parliamentary reporter with the National Post. Hello to both of you.
Hi.
So listen, you know, as Israel and the United States began their strike, that was roughly just hours after the Prime Minister arrived in India. And when we talk about India, it was always going to be an important trip, not just because of trade, but because it was being looked at as a reset in what has been a troubled relationship between the two countries. But then again, this conflict does begin in Iran. I'm wondering what that conflict, the impact it had on the agenda, Steph, and the tone of the trip itself.
Well, it reset the agenda, I think, in many ways. It overshadowed, I think, what the Prime Minister and his team wanted this trip to be about, the focus being, as you said, the reset with India, new deals that had been signed, just even the image of Mr. Carney sitting next to India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and showcasing kind of all the efforts that have gone into this diplomatic reset. But as you said, we were hours sitting in Mumbai when all of this happened. And as we'll get into, the Prime Minister's statement about throwing Canada's support behind the U.S. strikes, I think came as a bit of a surprise. And that added to the pressures and the questions about what exactly Canada's position was. But this was, and I would say this is probably the first time that we have seen a case where Prime Minister Mark Carney, who's done a lot of international travel, trying to shore up Canada's friends in different places in the world, has had to really kind of pivot on the spot and deal with something like this. And Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand, she was there as well. And I mean, this was a significant trip for her. She's done a lot of legwork in India in particular about with her counterparts. And then she's having to field questions and try and coordinate a response, not just in terms of what is Canada's foreign policy position, but also the coordination of how are we going to get Canadians in the region out in real time. So this is probably one of the most challenging situations the Prime Minister and his team have faced on a trip like this.
Okay, and I'll pick up on some of that. But Steve, first I'll get you to weigh in about how what took place in Iran essentially threw off the agenda for the government.
Well, as Stephanie said, Mr. Carney's trip was essentially overshadowed by this, and he had to spend the next few days recalibrating his answer. At first, of course, his statement of support for the attacks focused on the end result. That is, we cannot allow Iran to possess a nuclear weapon. But as the days went on, he sort of had to step back and temper his response by pointing out that he hadn't been consulted on the attacks and that it may appear to be a breach of international law, which is as close as he would get to condemning the attacks, and to point out that they would have preferred there be consultations with the UN. So yes, as this took away from the trip and the focus of the trip, and he had to spend a lot of airtime recalibrating his position over the next few days, especially when there was grumbling at home among the Liberal ranks.
Yeah, amongst the Liberal ranks, some very much in questioning what the Prime Minister had said. But, you know, Steve, I'd like you to stay on this and build on it a little bit, because it did seem very much to catch this Prime Minister and his office off guard, which I think raises the question as to how well prepared they are to use Stephanie's word here, to pivot when something like this happens.
Well, it's funny. I feel like every time Mr. Carney does something, Mr. Trump is there overshadowing it, whether it's the NATO meeting in the Netherlands or Davos or so on, what have you. So I think it's a fairly familiar routine now that Donald Trump will just insert himself into whatever you're doing. But no, Mr. Carney focused on the outcome, which was they want an Iran without nuclear weapons, but he didn't really backfill or nuance his position. And so he was wanting to speak about his reset with India, but this topped every story. This topped every broadcast hit out of there. So, it's not every day someone launches a war in Iran. So I don't think you could have been prepared for this, but it is kind of a bit of a syndrome now that every month Donald Trump seems to be, invading the news wherever it is, wherever you are.
Yeah. Listen, you referenced it, Steph, and you also just, Steve, about how what the Prime Minister was trying to achieve was overshadowed. But, there were significant deals signed, in particular with India and Japan. What do you think Canadians should know about those deals here at home, Stephanie? Because for the most part, this was not the top of the news agenda last week.
No, and I think coming out of India in particular, the most significant kind of deal that was signed was it was almost involving Saskatchewan and the company Cameco, the mining company Cameco, and the Indian government, with the Canadian government kind of in the middle for Saskatchewan to sell some $2.6 billion worth of uranium, given the fact that one of the big themes and messages coming from this trip was that India wants more energy that Canada has. So, that was kind of the biggest commercial arrangement. A lot of the other commercial arrangements that we saw about allowing India to have more market access, for Canadian companies to get more market access and vice versa. That had been in the works for a number of months or weeks ahead of time. But I think the energy deal was probably the most significant one. There were a number of memorandums of understanding signed. We haven't been able to see the text of those yet. And so I think there is still work do. All of these countries.
Although the goals are big, right? Like doubling
big.
trade within 4 years with India and a comprehensive trade agreement by the end of this year.
Absolutely. I mean, that was probably the comprehensive trade agreement. And I think what was interesting is that and going into this even, we knew that there had been good political will on both sides. There seems to be the only kind of potential way for this to be thrown off, I think, as if bureaucratic issues get in the way. So, I mean, it looks like smooth sailing on this front, but this was really a trip, I think, about sending the signals that they plan to work together, closer collaboration. We'll have to see what exactly comes up with the negotiations of the CEPA, because the timing of this trip was really to kind of formally launch those negotiations. Canada appointed a chief trade negotiator, and there is now a deadline of, I think, the G20 in middle of December. By the time that looks like it's going to get signed, with good signs coming from the Canadian government and the Indian governments that after launching this some 10 plus years ago, the first talks of this is actually going to get done. But again, the devil will always be in the details about what exactly, where there might be hiccups, whether this does get thrown off in any way, shape or form, or slowed down in any way.
Okay, so things to watch for in India. Progress made, but as you say, progress we'll have to keep watching. There was also the understanding that Japan and Canada out of this trip would be working on security and economic agreements as well. But you know, Steve, before we're done, I also want to talk about Canberra, because the Prime Minister did address the Australian Parliament. And in a lot of ways, it picked up on the themes that he addressed in Davos. What stood out for you on that leg of the trip?
What stood out for me was not what he said, but I was reflecting on the fact that no one else is saying what he's saying. So Mr. Carney delivered a couple of remixes of his Davos address to both to the Lowy Institute, which is a think tank in Sydney, and then of course in Canberra he addressed Parliament, much like Stephen Harper had done back in 2007 and other leaders have. Mr. Carney is repeating a message about how great powers are screwing us, and we have to work together as middle powers to find strength and build coalitions and so on. And he's got some interesting ideas, like for instance combining the European Union and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, somehow creating a free trade zone between them, and so on. But what struck me is he's giving this speech and no one else is. And one official remarked to me that everyone's happy that we're willing to stick our head above the parapet and criticize the Americans, but nobody else is following us. And that struck me as well. Is he's in demand. He's got a message, but it's not a message that other middle powers are repeating. So that I'm still curious as to why that is. It may be because they can't afford to.
Can't afford to, and much like the trade situation with India is something that we'll keep watching. But regardless, an important trip in the midst of a conflict now unfolding in Iran. Listen, Steve, Stephanie, thank you for this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, before we leave you this evening, let's take a quick look at what else happened in politics today.
We are living in a much more chaotic and dangerous world, and we know that national security and economic security really go hand in hand. And we're making general investments in defense, of course, led by my colleague, Minister McGuinty, and also my colleague, Minister Fuhr. And as all NATO countries are investing 5% of GDP by 2035. And so, in that context, we released our first defense industrial strategy. And our goal is also, through these different investments, is also to create jobs. And our objective is 125,000 jobs across the country, to increase by 240% the revenues in the defense sector, and also to increase by 50% our exports in defense.
Well, that is the Industry Minister Melanie Joly, joined in Ottawa by the Defence Minister David McGuinty and the Secretary of State for Defence Procurement Stephen Fuhr. All three announcing nearly $1 billion in new money for defence innovation today, money that will be used to develop drone innovation hubs in Ottawa and Montreal, a biomedical countermeasures initiative, and the purchase of a Bombardier Global 6500 aircraft for the National Research Council. All part of the federal government's defense industrial strategy that was unveiled last month. Also,
the fundraising numbers, as well as the excitement that our leadership race has generated, I think bodes really well for the NDP. It shows that there's a lot of action, excitement, enthusiasm, and participation in our leadership contest, and the fundraising numbers I think are unprecedented. I believe that so far we've raised more money in a leadership race than has ever been raised in any leadership race before in totality, and Mr. Lewis I think has set an individual record, so I think it bodes well.
The interim leader for the federal NDP, Don Davies, commenting today on new fundraising numbers from several of the candidates running to be the next leader of the party. According to Elections Canada, filmmaker and activist Avi Lewis raised over $1.2 million, money that includes donations up to and including February the 24th. In that same time period, the third column you see there, Union leader Rob Ashton raised more than $350,000. Heather McPherson, who has raised the second largest amount, has raised more than $560,000, a figure that tallies up donations up to February the 17th. And as for Tenille Johnston and Tony McQuail, well, those are the figures up to and including December the 31st of last year. The results of the NDP leadership contest will be unveiled at a party convention at the end of the month. Voting for the leadership started online at 12:01 a.m. earlier this morning. The voting will end the evening of the 28th. Plus, speaking of voting, yesterday the Prime Minister announced that 3 by-elections will take place on April the 13th. 2 of those by-elections will be in Toronto, in the ridings of Scarborough Southwest and University Rosedale. Ridings that were represented by 2 former Trudeau-era cabinet ministers, Bill Blair and Chrystia Freeland. The third by-election will take place in Quebec, in the Montreal riding of Terrebonne, a riding that the Liberals won by only 1 vote in the last campaign, with the Supreme Court annulling that vote last month after the result was challenged by the Bloc Québécois. If the Liberals win all 3 by-elections, the Prime Minister will get his majority in Parliament. And that is Primetime Politics for this Monday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.